Good.
All right. Our guest today is Kraus. Allie is a visual artist, craft person, maker, and educator whose primary medium is fiber. She weaves on hand looms, pieces and sews cloth, dyes fabric and yarn, and grows her own dye plants. In today's demo, designing at the thread level, techniques in weaving and dyeing. Allie will showcase the process of hand weaving on a multi-shaft loom and talk about how she uses dyeing techniques both before and after weaving. Allie, welcome to Fremont Art Association.
Thank you very much. Okay, so let's try this. I'm going to see, can you all see my face or do you see my loom? What's like featured here?
I see both. I see Allie has two squares.
Okay.
I'm looking for the spotlight for you and I'm not, wait a minute. Why can't I highlight you? Okay, I don't know.
If you highlight the alley that has my face on it, the yellow, there's like, at least on my screen, I see an alley that has like me, and then there's one that just says AK as my initials in the participant list. Um,
Wait a minute. Wait. Spotlight. There we go. I got spotlighted. Yay.
all right, awesome. Cool. So hopefully you all can see my face now. So I'm Allie. I'm a fiber artist that's based in San Jose. So I'm joining you all here from my home studio in San Jose. So this is the room that I primarily work in for all my dry kind of art practice. So I have looms in here. I have a big floor loom that is over behind me to my left. And I have a few other looms that are actually sitting behind my computer here that I can use to demo the kind of work that I do. So in addition to weaving, which is my most favorite thing at the moment and kind of primary art form, I also dye fabric and yarn. So I have, in addition to this kind of dry space here, I have a dye kitchen is what I like to call my backyard. But all that means is that I have a hose and some 5-gallon buckets and a camp stove. But that's where I do all my messy work outside because I do not want any of that in my dry space and near my looms. In addition to these two spaces, indoor and outdoor here, I also have a studio at Alameda Artworks in San Jose. So that's an artist studio space that has maybe 40 or 50 artists spread out among a few buildings. And so I encourage you all to come and stop by at our next open house and check out the space there. I use that space primarily for teaching. So I teach weaving out of that space. I teach sewing and dyeing as well, both there and at an offsite location. But I just love everything about fiber and hope to inspire folks to take their own fiber journey. So the roadmap of today's presentation is that I'm going to talk a bit about weaving just to start. So just the generic process of weaving, how you set up your loom, how you actually weave cloth, what woven cloth is, and how you would use one of these multi-shaft looms, which is what I have, in order to make cloth and make designs. I find that in my open studios, when I talk to folks, even other artists, most folks have no idea what weaving is, unless they've had a weaver in their family at some point. And I think it's really helpful to understand the process, to then understand kind of how I take it a little bit further and use weaving and dyeing techniques to add additional layers of patterning onto my cloth. So let's start and dive in and see one of my looms. So let me see if I can, we'll see if my penning thing works. If not, I might need to change the spotlight. Okay, so this might be a little tricky. I might need to have you change the spotlight for me to the other Allie Kraus, if that's okay. And that should be my loom spotlight. So through my presentation, I'm going to be jumping back and forth. There we go. Awesome. So I'm going to move my computer out of the way behind me here, just so I can make sure that you all are seeing what I want you to see. But we'll have you focus on my loom here. So this little loom is one of the looms that I use to teach. It's a smaller version of my floor loom that you all saw behind me. But this loom is a multi-shaft loom. And basically that means that you have these 4 frames that exist, which you can thread your threads into. So any piece of woven cloth is made out of 2 sets of yarn that are perpendicular to each other. You might have heard the terms warp and weft, which are very weaving specific jargon. But the warp yarns are these yarns that are here in yellow that are stretched from the front beam of my loom all the way to the back beam. And the warp yarn in any loom is just the yarn that's put onto the loom prior to the start of your project. The weft yarn goes 90 degrees, a 90-degree angle, so it's perpendicular to the warp yarn. And that's the yarn that the weaver then weaves thread by thread into the warp to create cloth. So typically, weavers will use something called a shuttle. This one here is a boat shuttle, I think because it looks like a little boat that carries your yarn. It's kind of like a bobbin on your sewing machine. It's like a little spool of yarn that you can then basically weave into your cloth or weave into your yarns to create cloth. So the warp threads and the weft threads will intersect to create like a single plane of fabric. So that's why all these yarns here are kind of individual, but once they interlace with your weft yarn is how you kind of get the finished fabric. So basically, in order to weave, what you are doing is you're interlacing these 2 sets of threads. And this style of loom makes that very simple. So instead of me basically lifting up certain areas and maybe taking a needle and weaving in and out to combine my threads, instead, I can use these levers on the side of the loom over here to raise and lower groups of threads in tandem. So that looks something like this. So I might, for instance, we'll pull down these 2 levers here to raise about half of my warp threads up in the air. And you'll see that now there's an opening at the side of the loom. So this opening here, this little tunnel in the yarn, is called a shed. A lot of weaving terminology feels like another language. So I'll try not to use too much of it, but that shed is where you then take your weft yarn and pass it through to create cloth. So here I'm putting one piece of yarn in like this. We'll kind of lock that in place. And then I'm going to use this part here called a beater to basically beat that yarn into this cloth so it becomes part of the fabric that I'm creating. And basically that is what weaving is in a nutshell. Regardless if you're doing it by hand or if you look in a factory and see a power loom doing this kind of thing in a more mechanical way, essentially you're just taking this yarn, or your machine is taking the yarn, passing it through the cloth, and then beating it into place, or passing it through the yarn, beating it into place until it becomes a finished piece of cloth. So these types of looms are pretty exciting. They have a lot more of a setup cost. And so we'll talk a bit about the time it takes to set up one of the looms in just a little bit. But given the fact that you can set them up in this way where you're threading them through various parts of the loom, it means that you can then use the loom to help you make more patterns in your cloth. So if you look at what I've already woven here, you can see that I have a section of cloth that's kind of a combination of the yellow warp and the blue weft. It's a little hard probably to see on Zoom, but you can kind of tell that there are areas that maybe have different textures. Some of these have like maybe more diagonal lines. Some are darker, some are lighter, like more yellow or more blue. And these are all different weave structures that are called structures. And basically it's the texture of the cloth. And it's how much you're seeing of either the warp or the weft thread to create that pattern. So if I wanted to do a textured kind of bit of cloth, what I could do is choose different levers to raise up and down in different orders. And doing that combination of raising and lowering these levers, which raises and lowers different sets of threads. This allows me to make all those different textures on my loom. So here, if I wanted to put another dark stripe like this is a twill stripe. So a twill is a type of weave that gives you these diagonal lines. And if you're wearing a pair of jeans, that's the kind of pattern that you see on your jeans is a twill. What I can do is just choose to raise and lower different levers. Let's see, let's start with maybe this one. I'll take my shuttle, I'll pass it through here, and then just feed it into place. And I'll keep going in a determined sequence. So I figure out kind of what my pattern is that I want to weave, figure out what that sequence of raising and lowering threads I need to get the pattern that I want. And essentially, it's kind of like you're following an algorithm. You're just repeating that sequence over and over again until you've woven the design that you want to weave. So a lot of weaving is really planning. You're spending your time deciding what textures you want in your piece, what colors you want, the order that you want all of these things, how dense your cloth is or how drapey it is. And all this stuff works together where you can really create a finished piece of cloth that's completely unique. That's pretty much designing it thread by thread. So here, if I wanted to, I could change the color, change the texture, and basically just make all kinds of different decisions here to change the appearance of my cloth. Okay. So the weaving part is actually
Allie,
pretty fast.
Allie,
Oh, yes.
excuse me. I think we forgot to mention to everyone, if you have questions, you can either ask Allie during the demo or put it in the chat and I'll ask the question.
Yeah, I love questions. So even if you're not a weaver or you have like a really niche weaving question, I welcome both of those. So feel free to unmute yourself and chime in or post it in the chat, and I'm happy to answer them as I go. So weaving is all about planning. So before I even get to this point where I'm weaving, I've already decided what kinds of patterns I want to weave, what colors I want to use. I have to decide how long these threads are that are on my loom because I have to set them up before I even start the project. And I have to also decide the thread count, essentially, of my fabric, about how many threads that I want in any given inch of fabric, because that will change the way the fabric looks and feels. And so you can really go into a lot of details here in planning. But generally, I find, especially for my work, that by the time I'm on the loom or touching the loom, I've made all those decisions. And the loom is just a tool that I use to help me execute this vision that I have. So it's a lot of like very mechanical, meditative, repetitive actions to basically execute this vision that I've already planned out all in advance. So let's step back a little bit and figure out kind of how I got to this point of actually putting my yarn on my loom, being able to weave and set these patterns, because the setup process is pretty intensive. The weaving is actually relatively fast, but the setup is really what takes a lot of time. And I teach an intro weaving class that is a 2-day class. The first day from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. is entirely loom setup. So it takes a lot longer than you may think. But it also is what allows you to make all kinds of really interesting choices about how you want your finished cloth to look. Because it's such a long process, I've made a little presentation that I'm going to show. So I have little video clips in there that will show sections of that process. And that way you can see the whole thing in a nutshell without having to go along for the entire kind of loom setup process. Okay, so I'm going to switch back to my computer and present something. So I might have to have you switch back. Here we go. Good. Thank you. Perfect. This is going great. Okay, so I'm going to share this keynote presentation. Okay, so let me press play here. So let's talk a little bit about the loom setup. So what exactly happens when folks are setting up a loom? So the first thing that you have to do is wind your warp. So that yellow thread that I had on the loom, before I even start my project, I have to figure out how many pieces of yarn do I want in my warp and how long they will be. So I use a tool called a warping board, which you can see a little bit behind me when my face is spotlighted. But it's basically a pegboard that then I can stretch my yarn and wind it on a path that will get me the exact length that I want. So if you look at the top left corner of the warping board, that is one end of my warp there. And then on the bottom right corner is the other end. And the yarn that stretches between those 2 points in kind of a Z shape is the entirety of my warp. And so this warp is 3 yards long. And I've decided that the warp that I put on my loom, that yellow warp that you saw, has 80 pieces of yarn in it. And so I have to basically wind 80 pieces of yarn that are exactly 3 yards long. And that's what I'm doing here. So basically when you wind them, you also want to make sure that they're not going to become tangled once you take them off the warping board. Because if the yarns become a tangled mess, there's no way you're going to be able to thread it on your loom and actually weave. So you'll see up at the top, there's these 2 pegs that are kind of closer together. And it's kind of hard to see at this angle, but what I'm actually doing is I'm crisscrossing my yarns to make a cross or an X shape between those 2 pegs. So one side of the yarn goes kind of under a peg and then over from right to left. The other one kind of goes from left to right in the same way. And so they alternate which side of the cross or the X that they are. And that simple crisscrossing of the yarn is what enables them not to tangle as I move them to the loom. So it's a pretty simple but magical invention. Once my warp is made, I can then remove this from the warp. Oh, go ahead. Yes.
Excuse me. So you said you need 80 pieces of the yarn
Yes. Yeah.
of the thread. So are you counting 1, 2, 3 as you're putting it on the board?
I do not because it's really hard to count.
That's what I was wondering.
So I didn't do this in the video, but essentially what I will do is I'll wrap a whole bunch and then I'll go back and count the threads that I've wrapped or that I've wound on this board. Usually wrap like a little string around bundles of maybe 20 or so. So I'll count 20, wrap them up, and then I can remember, oh, hey, I need 4 groups of 20, as opposed to having to count from 1 to 80 each time, because it's so hard to keep track of that. It's impossible, at least for me. But good question. Yeah. So this particular project, that yellow one that you saw on the loom, was only 80 threads. But the other projects that I'll show you later have smaller yarn, and I have 240 threads for each of those. And I've also done some projects that have had up to like 13 or 1400 threads. And so it really just depends on the project that you're making, how much yarn you have to organize in this way. So once the yarn is all stretched out on the warping board, I'm going to remove it from the warping board and cut those loops that you see on either end. And that will mean that I have these 80 pieces of yarn that are all 3 yards long, and they're ready to thread into my loom. So the first step is something called slaying the reed. So you're going to get a lot of really good weaving vocabulary from this. But this process is where I am starting to thread the loom. And this reed is one part of the loom that you might have seen me use my hands to beat cloth into, or beat the yarn into the cloth. So the first step is that I'm taking each and every one of those yarns and threading them in this metal comb-like thing called a reed. It's called a reed because back in the day, I believe these things were actually made of reeds, like plant kind of reeds. But today they're generally made of stainless steel, of steel of some kind. And the purpose of this reed is to allow you to set the density of your cloth. So that is like the thread count of your cloth, of how many threads you're going to have in every single inch of your cloth. So on the yellow cloth that I was weaving earlier, I had 16 pieces of yarn in every inch. So I basically am threading this in this reed here so that as it's kind of being threaded and distributed, in every inch of my reed, I will have 16 threads. And that means that my cloth will be the same way. Um, so this part takes some time, of course, because you have to thread each and every one of your threads into the reed. And it just depends on how dense you want your cloth. And so if I wanted to, if I had like a really big loom, I could have put, one piece of yarn in every slot here. And maybe I would have a cloth that's twice as wide as I am now. But for this particular project, in order to get me the thread density that I wanted, I'm putting 2 pieces of yarn in each one of these slots in the reed. And this is something that's completely customizable, just depending on how you want your cloth to look and feel. So we're going to go through this. Basically, I'm going to make sure that all my threads are threaded in here and generally centered in the center part of the reed. And then the next step is threading the heddles. So these heddles are essentially metal wires that rest on my frames or my shafts in the loom. And these shafts are the things that went up and down, so creating that little opening in my yarn. So each and every thread in my warp has to be threaded into one of these heddles. And this, I think, is the most time-consuming part of the process. Because unlike the reed, where maybe I can put multiple pieces of yarn in one of the slots in my reed, here in my heddle, every single yarn has to go through one of these heddles only in order for the loom to work and do the patterning that I need. And this is another thing that you can design and sort of you plan out ahead of time is your threading pattern. So which yarns you're putting in which heddles in which order. So all the heddles will live on one of these 4 shafts that's on my loom. And that means that when I raise or lower a shaft, all the yarn on that shaft is raising and lowering together. It like becomes a set. So they always move together. And so I can decide to thread my yarns in any kind of combination, put some on shaft 1, on 2 and 3 and 4, and in whatever order I want. And by threading it in different ways, I will get different patterns on my finished cloth. So generally, once you thread your loom, that threading will stay the same for the entire project, unless you want to completely unthread it and rethread it, which again is that really long set of tasks. But what's nice about it is that once you thread it in one way, then there's a whole family of patterns that you can make and textures on your cloth just by varying which of your shafts you raise and lower, in what combination, and in what order. So the set of costs is pretty extensive here, but the result is that you have a lot of flexibility in how you want your finished cloth to look. So this particular threading sequence that I'm doing is called a straight draw, and it's probably the simplest threading sequence that you can do. And essentially, I'm taking these threads in order, and I'm threading one through a heddle on shaft 1, the next one goes into shaft 2, the next into shaft 3, the next into shaft 4, and then I keep repeating that pattern, that sequence over and over again until I run out of yarn. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And that's basically threading the heddles. So once this process is done, you'll see I have these little ends of my yarn on this side. And what I'm going to do is tie these ends of my yarn to my loom and wind on the warp. So if you look on the right side, you'll see those loose ends have now been tied onto this metal bar, and my warp itself is longer than the width of my loom. This one here that I'm winding on is actually 2 yards long, but it's a little bit longer than my loom is wide. And so I need a place to put that excess warp. And so what I'm doing is winding all the extra length of that warp onto my back beam, back here, the warp beam, where it will lay and wait, waiting for me until I'm ready to weave it. So essentially, you wind on like this. You're separating the layers of your strings with paper just to prevent them from getting tangled on the loom. And then once I finish kind of winding everything where I have the ends now on the left side, I will do the same process and tie those ends onto a similar metal bar in the front. And then that is basically the weaving process of how you kind of set things up. And then when you're finished, you are back where we started in that initial image where you see the loom, It's all tied onto that front bar. We've woven some cloth, and we can just basically spend the entire time weaving that cloth. And as you weave the cloth, soon you'll have so much kind of cloth in front of your loom that you can't actually open your yarn wide enough to fit a shuttle. So then you're going to advance the warp. You're going to wind the cloth around that front beam, release some of the warp from the back beam so you have more space to weave again. And that process just repeats again and again until you finish weaving something. All right. Hopefully that made sense. That's basically what weaving is. So now you all are experts in weaving. You understand the process. And now I'll talk a little bit more about how I do my work. And Joan, I think I saw you on mute.
Yes, I think people need to experience this to understand how long it takes you to actually learn to do this. So very nice, Allie. Very nice.
Thank you. Yeah. I found that process the most very intimidating when I started weaving, so much so that it would like prevent me from starting new projects because I was so afraid that I would mess up at some point and it would ruin my entire project. But honestly, when you do it enough times, you realize that pretty much any mistake is fixable as long as you have the patience to do it. And so often that will be me stepping away from the project and then come back at a later time when I'm sort of not stressed out about messing up and then fixing those mistakes and continuing on. Oh, I see some questions here in the chat.
Allie,
Oh, yes.
can I just add my first direction for learning to warp the loom? I can't think of the woman's name. She wrote a nice book. She said, pour yourself a big glass of wine before you start. So gives you more patience.
It's true, but also I found that you make more mistakes and you don't realize it until later. So be careful. Be careful with your wine. All right, I'll answer some of these questions in the chat. So I see that Jay asked, when you buy yarn, do you wash it first to make it look stiff? Maybe some sort of starch. Great question. So for the most part, when I buy yarn, I'm not buying like the kind of yarn that you might think when you go to Michael's or a yarn store in those skeins. But in general, I'm buying a cone of yarn that looks something like this. So this yarn has a lot of length, which is what I need for my weaving projects, and it's very strong. But in general, if I'm just going to use it off the cone, I don't wash it. I leave it as is. Sometimes I know folks, if your yarn is really kind of squirrely or slippery, or there are certain times people will put a sizing on their yarn to help make it a little bit stiffer. But for the yarn that I use, generally cotton yarn, I never have any problem with that. And it's already like, it's not maybe as fluffy as like your knitting yarn. It's already pretty compact and stiff. Yeah. The next question, how long does it take to complete a simple standard piece? People always ask me this question, and I don't know because I don't time myself because I don't want to know how long it takes. So the answer that I can give is that I do teach this beginning weaving class. That's a 2-day class from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. for 2 days. The first day is entirely loom setup, where that whole process and videos that you see. For beginner weavers, it takes a whole day. If you're more advanced or if you use fewer threads, it'll take you less time. And then the second day is all weaving. So folks tend to weave anywhere from like maybe a foot of cloth to maybe even 4 feet of cloth. It really just depends on how complicated your pattern is and how many color changes you have and all this other stuff. Because if my pattern is really simple, like I'm doing a plain weave, like most standard weave, where I'm maybe pressing down levers 1 and 3, and then 2 and 4, and doing that over and over again, I don't really even have to think. I can just manually kind of press those levers. But if my pattern has a repeat that has maybe 20 steps in it, that's going to take me a lot longer to do because I'm going to very carefully be making sure that I do that repeat in the right order. So it really varies. And then when you add the dyeing techniques that I'm going to talk about next, it just increases exponentially. But I really like the process, which is why I do it, but it definitely is a very slow process. All right. So that is weaving in a nutshell. So you all kind of understand, what happens on the loom. And I'm going to talk about now how I add dyeing techniques to my weaving to create some designs that are really kind of attached to the threads themselves. So I'm going to do another little switcheroo. So I'm going to ask you to switch again my spotlight to my loom view. And I'm going to move this loom out of the way and move another one into position. Okay. So the nice thing about table looms, these looms here, is that they are small, which means that you can move them around pretty easily. So this is a project that I'm working on right now. That is a project where I have taken a piece of cloth that I've woven on my loom, and I have put a design on the threads themselves. So I probably should have picked two colors that were a little more different here. But if you look really closely, and let me see if I get my phone a little bit closer here, you can see that the background of my cloth here is white, but there are some areas that are just yarn here that have color on them. So here on this part of my cloth, most of the yarn is white, but I have this orange color that's only on certain yarns and only on sections of those yarn. So this is a technique where I'm applying dye to the threads themselves and then weaving them together and in these interesting ways that overlap and do different designs. So my warp here has this design painted on it. And I also have some weft yarn that is on a shuttle like this. So this is another type of shuttle that folks use in weaving. It's called a stick shuttle because basically it's like a stick that yarn is wrapped around. And this yarn also has some dye on it. It's a little bit hard to see because it is yellow, but I'll show you another set of yarns that I have that has more contrast on it to see what this looks like. And you'll see when you look at this yarn that it too has multiple colors along the length of it. So there's some yarn here that's white and some of it here that's blue. And so this color has been added to the yarn itself so that when I weave it at a particular width, I actually get a design that will appear in this cloth. So on this particular one that I've already started, what you can see, a little bit tricky because the colors are so similar, but there are orange designs that are on the warp threads, this orange kind of stripe here and here and here. It's reminiscent of a log cabin pattern, if you know quilting. And then there is a yellow dye that is on my weft threads that also is appearing and overlapping with my warp threads. So here you can mostly see it kind of in these areas here where there's certain parts of the cloth that are a little darker and maybe a little more blended than others. So here, the design that is orange is like a log cabin quilt block. The one that's in yellow is kind of like a 9-patch quilt block where you see 5 of the squares. So there's actually going to be 2 yellow squares here, 1 yellow square here, and then 2 others up here. And what's really interesting about this woven cloth is that, your warp and your weft threads are 2 completely different systems. So you can put different designs on each one. And when you weave them together, you get this really interesting blended design where you can see both images at the same time. They kind of merge into each other. And depending on the colors that you use, it can be more or less apparent. But basically, the way that I do this one, there are multiple ways of actually like adding colorant to the actual threads themselves. And for this particular piece, what I did was actually created a piece of cloth that was like a blank canvas, which I painted on. And then I took this cloth and unwove it into its 2 separate parts. So into their own like systems. My weft yarn is now back on the bobbin. My warp yarn is still on the loom. Then I can take these bundles of weft yarn and weave them back into the cloth in a different place from where I started. So for instance, this yellow design is actually a little bit further back on my warp. So you can see it back there where it was on my warp when it was originally painted. I unwove those threads And now I'm weaving them back in, but in a different place to have this overlapping design. So this technique doesn't really have a name. I call it unweaving and reweaving, which is basically what I'm doing, is making a cloth, then putting a design on it, separating those layers of the design. So I have 2 copies of that design that are a little less, they're like lower fidelity than the original version. And then I can use them to basically make images that are multiple layered, which I really enjoy. So let's look at the process of this too, just so you can see how I got to this point. And then I can do some weaving on this to show how I actually reweave the weft into the cloth, because it's a little bit different than just kind of your standard weaving, because I want to do it in such a way that my design will appear on my fabric. So I'm going to switch back again to my computer, keeping things interesting. Okay, so if you could switch me back, thank you. Thank you so much for all this, all my switching. You're doing great. Okay, so I see a question from Amy. Do you add the dye after you do that winding step in the beginning so the threads are lined up? Yes. So for this particular version, which I'll show you in just a second, I do it actually after I make the cloth, but then after that, I'll talk about a technique where I dye the warp. After I wind it, I'll resist dyed or tie dye it to make basically another way of adding dye onto my fabric. Okay, so let's go back to my keynote slide. So this is the unweaving and reweaving, and let me make sure I'm sharing. All right, here we go. So unweaving and reweaving. So first thing is that cloth that you saw just now started its life as a plain white blank canvas, you might say. So this particular yarn has 240 pieces in my warp, and they are 30 ends per inch. So my thread count is 30 compared to the 16 I did before. So the yarn is much finer and it's more dense than the original project that you all saw. In my design that I planned out, I decided that I want to have these sections on my cloth that are about 9 inches wide. And so in order to help me measure that and kind of demarcate it, I'm weaving in a single strand of linen. That's what that kind of dark mark in the middle of my cloth is. That is an undyed piece of linen that I just stuck in there to help me kind of mark the edges of my design so I could tell where that 9 inches started and stopped. So this take a long time. Basically, I wove maybe 45 inches of cloth in this way or a little bit more. And now I have to apply dye to it. So I brought my loom outside. This is my loom that you just saw. She's sitting there back on the table. And my warp is still actually tied into my loom. So it's still in the reed. It's still threaded through the heddles. I have done processes where I have taken that yarn off and then rethreaded it back on, but that takes even more time. And so I also sometimes will leave the cloth kind of connected to the loom, but just untie it from that metal bar in the front. So I have one free end that I can work with. And then I plan out my design. And so typically I really like abstract art. I do a lot of stuff with geometric shapes and geometry inspired by like kind of quilting designs, or brutalist architecture I really like, which is those really large buildings made of concrete that are super blocky, but also have a lot of geometric shapes. And so frequently I'm making these stencils where I've already kind of mapped out these designs. And these stencils are made out of paper. And so I'm just positioning them in between my little dark lines of linen so that they're centered in each and every one of these windows. So the first 2 blocks you'll see were the ones that I showed you in that, we did that little demo earlier. So that orange one will become that log cabin block. There's that little one that looks like a dice, almost like a number 5. That's there, that will become yellow. And then the other stencils I'm placing on have other shapes that are borrowed from different brutalist buildings that I found out that I really like. So once all these are on, then I'm going to start to paint them. So let's go on to the next slide. So here I am moving on painting the warp. I've already painted 1 block here and I'm working on the next one. But for this process, I'm using fiber reactive dye paste for this. So this is fiber reactive dye. For those of you who do any fabric dyeing, I'm using Dharma Trading Co.'s Procyon or fiber reactive dyes. And essentially this is a dye system that works on plant-based fibers. But I take the dye powder, and normally it's kind of like a bath. So it's like a colored, bucket of liquid. But I'm making sure it's not super watery. So I took the dye and added some sodium alginate, which is like a seaweed-based thickener, to make it more like a gel or a paint. And that allows me to place it on my cloth with more precision, and hope that it won't bleed or spread. My design will kind of stay as I intend it to. So here I am, using my brush, I'm using that stencil and trying to really push that dye into my fabric so it touches all the layers of it, the warp and the weft, the top and the bottom. And then when I'm finished with the design and everything feels kind of like soaked in, I will take some paper towel or some kind of towel to blot off the excess dye. Because even though the dye is really thick with this sodium alginate, it's still a dye, it's still liquid. And you've probably seen anytime you take a dry cloth and use it to like mop up liquid, it'll just suck it up and wick that moisture away. And so ideally what I want is for that moisture, that dye, to stay in those areas that will allow me to make the design. And that's why I'm blotting off the excess. So as the dye cures and kind of fixes onto the fabric, I know that it's not going to spread and make my design blurry. So this right here, I'm using these synthetic dyes, but I've also experimented with different techniques for applying that color onto my fabric. So I've used natural dyes in the same way. So for that, basically, I'm taking some kind of natural material like a plant, flower petals, roots, leaves, and trying to extract the color from it, add a thickener, and then paint it on my fabric in the same way with some like mordant paste, which is what allows it to bond with the fabric. I find that natural dyes tend to be a lot more maybe like gloopy or viscous, so much so that I always feel like I have to heat set that dye in place, and I have to rinse it really well so that it will unweave and not get in the way of my cloth. But with fiber reactive dyes, they're pretty low profile, I guess. They really absorb into the fabric. And that's another thing about the dye that I use when I'm painting my cloth, is that it's unlike something like a silk screen or a screen print where the dye or the paint will rest on the surface of the fabric. The dye that I use here, I really want to be basically part of the threads themselves, because if it's resting on the surface and kind of binding all those threads together, I can't unweave it. It would be basically, I have to kind of like break that thread apart, or the paint apart, as I unweave my threads. But here, with these materials where the dye actually bonds with the fibers themselves, I am able to unweave it and, weave that cloth in a different way. So after I do my design, I'm going to remove the stencil because I'm done with it. So you'll see that in a second here. And then there's one final step that I like to do with my cloth, and that is I will paint the edges of my cloth. So you can see that on the yellow one, and you see me doing that here with the orange. And this step is, I guess, an optional step here, but it gives me a signpost or a little landmark. As I weave my cloth back in, I need to make sure I know where the edges of the cloth are, so that when I weave it back in, all the design will align in the same way it did when it was first in the cloth, in order to make something that makes sense and looks, similar visually. You can do this by like very carefully lining up the edges of your design as you weave, but I find it much easier to have this little blip of dye on the sides as my signpost, because it makes lining up my design so much easier. And often if I will do this with a different color too, so that way I know that if I have a blue dot on the side, that is my like little edge marking. And if I have this like red color, for instance, then that's my design. So generally I'll make my cloth wide enough that those edges won't be seen. They're sort of my little signposts. They get folded or, put behind a frame. But I actually kind of like how they look. I think they look pretty interesting. So once this particular design is painted on here, the next step is that I rinse my cloth. So although these dyes are pretty low profile, I don't want them to come off on my hands. Oh, actually, I should say I let that cure. So I let that basically sit overnight so the dye would cure and bond with the fabric. Once it's bonded, I'm able to rinse it in this water without the dye kind of coming off. There will be some dye that comes off in the rinsing process because that's the nature of fiber reactive dyes. But you can still see that even after rinsing, the colors are really vibrant. So it's still attached to the loom through this whole process. And I just make sure that I have enough thread coming out of my loom that the water doesn't wick back up and damage the wood, because I would not want that to happen. Once that dries, what I'm going to do is essentially put it back on the loom. So I'm going to take all that excess yarn and wind it back on that back beam. I'll tie that front part of the cloth to the front beam, wind that excess cloth in there, and then I unweave it. So I'm going through that exact same process that I did before, but instead of weaving it, I'm going the other way and I'm removing the cloth thread by thread. So here I'm sticking my shuttle through into the cloth opening, and then any excess yarn that I pull out, I'm winding around that shuttle. And so that yarn now is its own separate entity, apart from the cloth, that I can then reweave in a different place. So what you can see if you look at the cloth there, kind of right where I'm weaving that green part, that there's a part that looks a little more patchy, and that's the part that I've already unwoven. So it's only the warp threads that you're seeing there. The weft threads are having the other half of the design. And you can see that on the shuttle there, there's like bits of white, bits of green, because that's where the other half of the design is. It's now living in that weft yarn. And the part that looks a little more solid, that's like the more clear, the darker, the stronger white and the clearer green are the parts of my cloth where both the warp and the weft threads are present. Sometimes when I do this process, I wonder why I'm doing this, because it's really time consuming, but there's something about it that's really interesting too. I don't know why. I'm really drawn to it. I like this idea of taking an image apart into breaking it down into different parts and then putting it back together in a different way. And I find that's kind of like quilting too, where you have a piece of fabric, you cut it apart into smaller pieces, and then you sew it back together again into its own entity. And I'm really drawn to the effects that you can do with the design as you weave it in. So you can basically take that weft yarn, like I could weave this green part, but weave it again over the blue part that's right up above it to get these overlapping designs. Or I could take that green yarn and basically weave it back into the cloth, but in a way where it's flipped or mirrored. And so it's the same design kind of overlapped on top of each other, but from a different orientation. And so you get these really interesting blended effects that happen. So that's unweaving. Okay, so I'll stop the share for now. And we can jump back to my loom. So we can see this in progress. Sorry to make you change me yet again. Here we go, yeah. So if I had a little more time, I would have probably tried to move the warp further down to get that green part where you can see. But I'll show you what it looks like here on this yellow part. And let me raise this a little bit so that I'm not gonna hit my camera as I go. So essentially what I'm doing is I'm just taking my loom, and looms make a lot of mechanical noises. So if this feels too loud, let me know and I can mute myself while I weave and then unmute myself and talk about it. But I'm gonna open up my yarn and try to figure out, okay, what's the opening that will allow me to pull the yarn smoothly like this? So I loosen it. Oh, sorry, I'm doing this backwards. I already unwove it and now I'm at the point where I'm reweaving it. So I'm gonna basically take the yarn, feed it into the cloth like so, take my shuttle through, and I'm just gonna place it in, and I'm looking for that little notch that's in the side. So here I can kind of see it. It's hard to see on the camera because the color is so close to the yarn, but you can also see there's like a little kink that's right there. And you'll also get those little kinks that are built into the fabric just because this is where that yarn wraps around the edge of the cloth. And so I align that with the edge there, close it, and then beat it into place. And that allows me to make sure that my design is going to line up in the same way that it was when I originally started. So you'll get the same thing. And I wish these colors were darker so you could see. But basically what you can do is play around a little bit with this. So you can decide, like for instance, this one, I actually wove it a little bit earlier and decided that the two designs didn't overlap in the way that I wanted to. So I unwove them, added a little bit more filler yarn to bump up this yellow design, and that way it overlaps a little bit more with the orange. But basically, yeah, I'm just going to weave this again and then see the cool blended designs that I create. So when I do this kind of process, I do a lot of planning where I am, making my design and make sure my loom is behaving the way that she should. Here we go. So I'm doing a lot of planning to figure out, what's the weave that I want to do, the density of my cloth, the size of my design to make sure everything lines up. But I don't always plan like how I overlap them here. And often that's something that I do once I get to the loom. So I'll decide as I go, like, oh, I think this yellow would go really interesting over this orange. And when I do that, it makes it a little fun and interesting. It's like a kind of a surprise where I kind of know what's going to happen, but I don't quite know. And the design just appears before me in the finished cloth. But again, sometimes I question why I spend so much time with this, but I think it's just a really kind of fun and interesting process. And I just love being able to take something, take it apart, put it back together in a different way. And I've done this here with geometric designs, but I've also done this with designs that have text in them, where when they are right side up, you can actually see the letters. When they are not the right side up, they might be flipped or mirrored. And let me see if I can grab that right now to show you what that one looks like. Can't find it at the moment, but I do have a picture later on in the slide deck I can show you. But basically anything you do, you can kind of take it apart, weave it back in a different way to really interestingly blend those designs. So we'll do a little bit more here, like this. And then we'll see, hopefully you can see a little bit of this on the block. So you can maybe see, if you look at the center block, again, it's really hard, but there's some lines here that have kind of a crisp edge on certain sides. So on this orange one, there's a straighter edge here. And then this part's a little bit funkier. It's a little bit more feathery. And that's because the orange is on the warp thread and those threads will shift this way. On my yellow here, the design has a little bit more feathering on these edges, because even though I'm trying to line up everything perfectly here, it's going to be a little bit off. And so I'm going to have a little bit of feathering in the direction the weft yarn can shift like this. So even if I were to like basically weave, my yellow weft on this side and then weave my orange weft on the piece that's back there, the yellow part that's there, the two designs would look pretty different because of the way the threads can shift. It'll either shift this way if it's a weft thread or this way if it's a warp thread. All right, so that is unweaving. And at the end of the presentation, I'll show some other pictures and other designs that I've done with that technique. Okay, so, oh, here we go, let's see. Oh, Joan is leaving. Thanks, Joan. Okay, so the next thing that I'm going to talk about, I'm going to actually, let's use my phone here. So we're going to stay on this demo side, and I'm going to move this to look at my loom that's in the back. So if you check out my floor loom over here, you will see another technique where I have put colorant directly onto my threads. And this has a similar look to the project that I just did, but it has a different setup. And so this is ikat. This one has a name, and it's something that's done by different cultures all over the world who have different sort of motifs and colorants and yarns and densities that they use on their cloth. But let me get a piece of paper here so you can see the design. So this particular cloth, when you look at it, maybe with something behind it, you can see that certain threads are dyed in the space dye fashion, where some of the yarns are green, some are white in these specific areas. And when you step back, you can see that these are dyed in such a way that it creates this circle design. And so this is kind of what Amy was asking about earlier, is wrapping and dyeing the threads when they are in that warp chain. And that's what I do on these, is basically resist dye my yarn before I put it on the loom. So here it's not tensioned yet, it's just kind of on the loom, ready to be tensioned. But now, I don't have to unweave it. The design is already encoded onto the yarn. And then I can just basically weave into this and make a cloth that has this design that I've already pre-planned out. So I'll show you the process of what that looks like, of how I actually do this ikat dyeing. So we're gonna set it up back here and move this out of the way. So what you'll see if you look at my table is that I have these metal boards on it, or these boards with these metal nails. So this is a weaving tool that's called a rattle with a D, rattle with a D. And it's used when folks set up their loom in certain ways. But it's also something that I can use to stretch my yarn across to be able to wrap it in such a way to dye it so that it looks that each individual piece of yarn will have sections that are dyed and undyed. So I made a little pretend warp right here. That's pretty small. This one is only about 1 yard long, so just a demo. And I have these rattles that are stretched and clamped to my table. And so if I'm going to be doing ikat, what I will do is I'll take my warp, I'll secure it onto one of the nails that's over here, stretch it all the way across my table like this, so that I have it nice and taut. And this is a surface that then I can wrap with a water impervious thing to resist the dye from adhering to my warp. So typically the warps that I do are longer than the tables that I have. So this warp is just a little bit longer. It's maybe 6 inches too long. But what I'll do is I'll kind of firmly put it in place, take a weight like a knitting machine weight, or even use a clamp or a water bottle, and then just hang it off the side. So it gives a little bit of tension and keeps that yarn really nice and taut across my table, which is easier to work with when things are very tensioned here. And typically when I do ikat, I have a plan. So I'm trying to wrap my yarn in such a way that I'm intentionally trying to create like a design in it. So often I'll make a drawing or something like this, which is a representation of how I want my finished cloth to look. So in this drawing, you'll hear this called a cartoon from folks who do ikat. What you see here is that there are areas that I've marked out that have this kind of colored part on them. And this is my code that I want to wrap these in some kind of water impervious material to resist the dye from adhering to these sections. And then this area in between are ones that I'm just going to kind of leave natural, leave kind of as is. And often I use these boards with the nails because I'm winding. I have these little sections of yarn. I'm doing a whole bunch of them together to make one finished piece. And so often the designs are kind of relative to each other. So here, for instance, like this kind of pattern makes a bit of a checkerboard. And so what I want is basically my warps to be aligned next to each other so I can more accurately line up the sections that I'm resist dyeing here. So the way that looks basically is I will take some tape like this. So this is like a packaging tape, or it's sold as ikat tape. So it's like a thin plastic material that's pretty easy to work with, but also will resist the dye. And take some scissors. So here what I'll do is, cut off a piece of it like this. See if my little scissors will cut this. There we go. This here is pretty wide to work with. It's easier to work with when it's smaller. So I'll cut a little section of it like this, like a little stripe. And then I'm basically going to use this pattern to help me know where I want to wrap the tape around it. So what I'll do is I'll take it and basically just go like this, cinch it around, tugging as I go to block off that area that I've marked in my design, like this. Usually I go one side through and then I go back again. So it's double wrapped, and that extra helps prevent dye from getting touching these yarns. And then I'll tie that in place with a knot like this. And so this little section, when I stick it in a dye bath, it should prevent dye from adhering to this part of my yarn. And so what I will do then is go ahead and basically wrap each of the sections here that I've marked out on my pattern in order to block off my design. And so when you're doing this kind of ikat, what you are doing is thinking about, how many threads you want to have each kind of design on them. So for instance, like this bundle here is, I don't know, maybe about 30 threads or 20 threads, but it's all nice and tight in this bundle. But when I put them on the loom, they're going to be spread out in a certain way. So if I have a thread count of like 20 different pieces of yarn per inch, and if I have a bundle of 20 yarns here, although this looks really thin, when I put it on the loom, it will spread to have a width of about 1 inch. And so that's the kind of design thinking that I'm doing, is figuring out, where I want these areas to be blocked off, and then how wide I want each of these stripes to appear on the loom. And this process takes time too. So it's important to, take your time with it, be as precise as you can, and to make sure that you're wrapping the yarn or the fabric wrapping the yarn very tightly with the plastic. Because if you're spending all of this much time encoding your design into your yarn, you want to make sure that design will actually stay there. If your yarn is pretty loose, or your plastic or your wrap is pretty loose on your yarn, it means that dye will seep in underneath that plastic and will add color where you don't want your color to be. Sometimes if that happens a little bit, it can look kind of nice. It gives a really interesting feathered edge or a halo on your design. But in general, I prefer to, do it pretty tight to make sure that my design looks as I intend. I'm gonna do this last one here, like this. So this style of wrapping, I have my design already plotted out, and I am basically counting on the fact that when I put these pieces of yarn on my loom, I'm going to keep them in this orientation, where if I had a bundle here and a bundle here that were dyed in that way, they're going to stay kind of at that same height, I guess. Like they're going to, these parts that are resist dyed are going to be in the same orientation relative to each other as they are when I started, like when I was actually doing the wrapping. And sometimes here, if you don't have enough plastic to cover your piece, you can just take a new piece and keep going on. Where I'll go like this, wrap it some more just to kind of cinch it in place, and then continue on to the start like that. Until I get back to that free end and tie it in place. Oops. So here I'm doing knots that are like square knots, or maybe a half a square knot. But you can also do it in such a way where it's kind of a slip knot, which makes it a lot easier to undo all these bundles after you dye them. If they're not tied super securely, there's a chance they could kind of unraveled in the dye bath. But for the most part, they stay pretty stable. Generally, my yarn will be longer than the table that I have to work with. And so what I'll often do is just kind of take it, slide it down, put the other end on there, just kind of move everything down together, re-weight it off the other side. And then maybe I have another separate cartoon or drawing that I would put under the rest of the work to finish doing that design and that pattern out. So at this stage, let's say I'm done here. What I would then do is place this in a dye bath. So any part that is just the pure white yarn here will take on the color of the dye, and anything that's wrapped in this plastic here will retain the original color of the yarn. So I have a little one that I've already done, the magic of television, where I've already wrapped this one and I dyed it in a purple dye bath like this. And so you can see this is what it looks like when it comes out of the dye bath. You still see these purple or these green areas where my tape is. And then anything that was originally white here has now taken on the purple color that I dyed it. So once you do that, you then actually just cut or remove the plastic wrap like this. So when I remove it, you will see that the area underneath it is white, which is pretty cool. There is a little bit of bleeding that happens where some of the dye will wick underneath the teeth. So the edges aren't always super precise, but I think that adds to the charm of the technique. You know, if I wanted it to be incredibly precise, I probably wouldn't go through this process and I would just screen print on finished cloth. But I like that feathering. So that feathering happens when dye is wicked underneath the fabric or wicked underneath the teeth. And it also happens when you tension things on the loom, the yarns will move a little bit relative to each other to cause that little feathered edges. And here you can see that there was a hole in my tape where maybe I didn't wrap it completely enough. So I have a little bit of a speck of purple that happened in my design. But I think that'll look actually really interesting. It'll be like a little blip of purple in my main design. So once you do this, you're basically then unwrapping all your sections. And you will have, you know, how many ever pieces of yarn that you've dyed, and they're all dyed in the same pattern. So it's kind of like a Morse code in a way. You have this like one string of yarn that has these like dots and dashes of color, some colored, some white, and they are a message that you have encoded into the threads of your cloth. And if you do a lot of wraps here, this process also can take quite a bit of time. So generally I will use this plastic ECOT tape because it works really well. It's pretty easy to, you know, tear and tie, to wrap and remove. But you can use pretty much anything that will resist dye. So it's basically just a precision tie dyeing technique. So I've used just string. I've taken string and tied it really tight on my yarn, like little blips like this actually at the end. We'll take that one off and see what that looks like. So even though the string itself might be water, it might, you know, absorb water as you put it in your dye bath. The fact that it's like compressed super tight on your yarn, that compression will prevent any sort of dye from wicking underneath that string. So this is just like a little knot that I made, one piece of string, and you can even see that there's a little line there made from that compression. And we'll do the same on the other side to undo this one. Like this. So then, yeah, you have this yarn that you can just basically thread onto your loom as is. And as you spread it out, you will see that you don't just have this one strand, but you have a whole section, like basically a rectangle of your design. And you can also kind of, you know, put it on just like this if as you intend, if you know, have planned it like that. Or you can shift the yarns relative to each other. So what I'm going to do now is this was kind of looped in place. So I'm going to cut this apart just so that each of my pieces of yarn are separate from each other. They're not tied at the ends, like this. Let me get my big scissors for that. There we go. So if I want to, I could keep all these yarns in the same orientation relative to one another. But you can also do shifted ECOT designs. And that's where maybe you dye it all in the same way. But on the loom, I might spread apart this warp where instead of having these line up exactly kind of as they were in the bundle, I can shift them relative to each other to make different patterns. So they'll always have the same pattern where it's like, you know, color, non-color in this order, but you can change the relation of how they are next to each other, either by bundles like this, or you can actually take each individual thread and shift it relative to its neighbors to make more subtle changes. And that's what I did on that piece that I showed you earlier, where I basically dyed it in the same way like this, but then shifted all the threads relative to each other to make a really gradual curve to get that circle design. And this was dyed with fiber reactive dyes. I've also done this with natural dyes. But one thing that I think is really cool about the fiber reactive dyes is that some of the colors are made from like mixtures of different compounds. And so if you look really closely at this, you can see that although the color here is purple, there is some blue kind of on the edges here. It might not come across super well in the camera, but that's because certain colors will bleed more than others. So the purple, maybe there's like a red in it that's pretty like fast to this area, but the blue element of it has seeped under my tape a little bit more than the purple. And so you get this blue halo around the design, which is pretty neat. And some of the fiber reactive dyes do that more than others, and folks will capitalize on that to basically have this like color separation happen in these areas where it's kind of resisted right on the border. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how I made the piece that we saw in the loom a little earlier. So I have one more switch back to my computer, and then that should be the last one. Okay, so I'll bring up my presentation again. Okay, and if you could just spotlight my computer camera and not my phone camera. There we are. Yay, thank you. Okay. So let's pull up that presentation again. Okay, so we'll look at the ECOT. So that piece that you saw on my loom, we already wrapped it, looked like this before I put it on my loom. So I dyed 2 different shades of green that were slightly different from each other, and they were both wrapped in a similar pattern of these areas that were, you know, white, original color of the yarn, and then this green color here. So in order to shift things thread by thread, you have to be pretty precise with how you're changing the yarns, because otherwise it's very hard to get a gradual curve. And so what I often will do is I'll make a template out of fabric that I stitch each end of my yarn into. So I'll stitch the end of the yarn in and kind of pull it snug. And all the yarns are the same length because I wound them all to be that way. And that little end of the yarn gets threaded in to these little markings that I've made on my cloth. And as you can see, as this line kind of shifts down, this little circle that you'll see, that will basically shift the yarn relative to its neighbors as I tension it on the loom. This process, again, is another time-consuming one where each and every bundle of threads there needs to be stitched onto this fabric in order for me to have them all kind of line up and make the circle design. So the way that I do this is I'll take a piece of fabric, I'll mark out those little lines where I'm stitching my ends in so that they're all kind of at the right density for that design, and they all are done in such a way where they make that gradual curve. So I take a needle, I thread those ends in the fabric, and then on the back side, basically I'm threading not a single strand, but a pair of strands together that's still looped on the end. And then on the back side, I'm slipping like a thicker string in the back to hold that in place. And that way I can ensure that the very tip of my warp yarn is right where that dot is on my fabric. And that enables me to make sure that each thread is kind of shifted the right amount. So you'll see I threaded it on the end of the needle, I'm pulling it through, and it's pulled through as a loop. And then there's a thread on the back side that then gets pulled through that loop like that. And then I go on the front side and take that yarn and snug it back into place. And that will basically just allow me to shift that yarn ever so slightly to make this curve. And for this particular design, to make a circle, what I have done is I've made 2 of these sets of warps, like those 2 different colors. And I have one that is shifted to be like the top part of the circle and one that's shifted to be the bottom part of the circle. So they're sort of 2 semicircles, but when they are threaded, interlaced between each other, it makes it look like a circle on the loom. Okay, so I'm just gonna still stay on my camera, but we'll go back again to this particular warp. So you can see again, now that you know the process, how it was done. So you'll see that we look at on the back of the loom, that piece of fabric that I stitched now is tied to the back of the loom. So instead of tying the individual bundles of yarn, I'm tying the cloth itself. And then as the yarn gets pulled through that design, you will see that each one is shifted relative to each other to make that circle shape. Definitely the threads will shift as I tension them on the loom, as I like take each bundle and pull it tight and make sure that it is threaded correctly. They will shift relative to each other, so it won't be as precise a circle. It'll look the most precise the closer the yarn is to that initial thread or the additional cloth that's there. But as the warp goes on and as I tension it, the circles will gradually kind of dissolve, become more chaotic as every little minute shift then compounds as it goes down the warp. And I also think that's a really interesting process of actually kind of seeing, even if you don't know what's happening, you're kind of seeing bits of the process and the finished work of all the little tensionings of each individual thread in order to make the design. All right. So I'll show you a couple of pictures of other finished pieces that I've done, so you can check them out. Unfortunately, my pieces right now are at my studio hanging up there, so I don't have them with me, but I think it's also probably easier to see it in a presentation as opposed to trying to hold it up in front of the camera. So these are 2 pieces that I've done with the unweaving technique. So the one on the right, or sorry, the one on the left is this very simple graphic of these abstract flowers. And what I ended up doing was painting just one half of that side. So imagine that kind of darker side, the one that's angled to the right, up and to the right. I painted these green stripes with a little circle at the end. I then unwove that design and then rewove the wefted but mirrored it. So basically I started my shuttle on the other side so that the design would essentially be flipped left to right. And you can see here that where the 2 designs overlap, the color is darker because you're seeing color in both the warp and the weft. You're getting kind of the full color picture. But the areas where they don't overlap, it's a little bit more of a ghost image. And what's kind of interesting on this one too is that the flowers that kind of go up and to the right are darker than the other side. And that's because when I made the cloth, I actually wove it in such a way that there was more like warp yarn per instead of weft yarn in every single inch of my cloth, like a square inch. And that means that the warp yarn took in more of the design. And that's why the side of the design that has on the warp threads is like a darker color. On the right over here is, it is one that I did with words. So I took this quote from a 1700s embroidery sampler that I thought was very relevant to today's textile work. I printed it on my cloth and then I unwove it and rewove it again. For the text, I wove most of them kind of over atop the original part. So it sort of merges together, but looks a little bit ghostly. But then on the top half, there are a couple words that I mirrored that basically I started on the other side. So you'll see that the words themselves are reflected. This word taught is reflected and ends is reflected. And then on the bottom, I rotated them around. So I took that little section of warp that said to write, and then when I wove it back in, I flipped it upside down. So I started kind of from the top instead of the bottom to make this image that rotates. And this is something that I found really fun, and I want to do more kind of work with these, with the text to see how I can manipulate these words and move them around the cloth. to create interesting designs. And here's a few examples of ECOT pieces that I've done. So the top one is done with dye with natural dyes, but done in a very similar way to the one that we saw in the loom there. So these yarns were interlaced and then woven in this curved fashion. For this one, I used 2 more contrasting colors for each section of the cloth. And it creates this really interesting effect where you can see in some places some of the red, others some of the purple, and then these darker areas that where both colors are, and the really bright white areas are where none of the warp was dyed. And that's one thing I really like about these kind of overlapping designs is the overlapping images that are created where those patterns interlace. And then the one on the bottom there is actually another ECOT design where I encoded the image of a plastic bag into my weft threads and wove it into cloth. So this is what I actually did when I was at Penland with Susan. But I basically took some weft thread, mapped out basically those combinations of lines and dashes that would become a plastic bag when woven at the right width, and then wove it into the cloth in order to make this composition that made it look like the bag was like tumbling in the wind. This is like a fact, when you have that design on the weft thread, you can do that rotation and reflection to it to be able to, spin it around. And so I thought that was a fun way to play with this. One of the disabilities of the cloth is to be able to manipulate that weft however you see fit. All right, that's my presentation. Did a deep dive into my extremely time-consuming fiber obsession. And I hope that was not too much information and that it made sense. But if anyone has any questions, I'd love to hear them. Okay, Lena says, have you woven with silk? Yeah, good question. So I have woven a little bit with silk. I would say I use cotton the most because it is pretty easy to work with and it's very readily available and not super expensive. Some cotton will give you like a little bit of a sheen too. So the yarn that I have on the loom, that green yarn, is a mercerized cotton, so it has a little bit of shine that you might get with silk. But silk obviously generally has a lot more luster to it, and it's more slippery, I found, than cotton yarn. And so mostly I just kind of take care to, when I'm securing my yarn on the loom, to do so in a way where I, I'm going to make sure it doesn't slip in ways that I don't want it to. But every fiber is really different, like both in how it takes color, how it kind of like stretches and moves. So cotton's like pretty standard. It's like, the clothes that we have all around, most of the fabrics we have are cotton, and silk has like a really beautiful drape to it and a beautiful shine. Wool has kind of like a puff to it. It has a lot more of like a volume to it. And wool takes color really, really well. And linen is another one too that I think is really fun to weave with because it has some body to it. So the finished cloth will like move and kind of move and really take on the wind. And I don't know, it definitely has a life of its own. So that plastic bag piece I made was actually done in linen.
I kind of understood basically how weaving was, and then watching you today, it's like, whoa. It was complicated to follow.
Sorry about that.
No. It was interesting to know what can be done. I mean, I knew the basic, how to do some basic weaving. You've gone way beyond, and it's just been fascinating. Thank you so much. I don't know what anybody else might have.
Yeah, I would say if you're interested in weaving, don't be put off by my dyeing techniques. That's like super niche. Weaving does have that setup process, but it's pretty fun once you get there and you can make really amazing textures on your cloth. So don't let the dyeing stuff intimidate you. That's kind of like a rabbit hole that you either can fall down once you understand a little bit more about the process, or you can just avoid that entirely and go down your own different weaving rabbit holes.
And how long have you been weaving?
I've been weaving since, so I started on a rigid heddle loom, which is a more simplified version of the kind of looms that I work on today. Those looms are much easier to set up, but they also have a lot more limitations in how to, like what kind of patterns you can weave. And I started that in 2015. And then in 2019, I started working on these multi-shaft looms. So that was like 6 years ago now. But it's one of these things where, I've been working in textiles for quite a while, but when I learned how to weave on one of these looms, it just really captivated me, and I have not stopped since. And I always just want to keep learning new techniques and figuring out, what I can do and how to really push the envelope in terms of like what these individual threads, what you can do with them.
Very impressive. Does anyone else have any questions or comment?
Well, thank you, everyone. I really appreciate the ability to be able to present and like think through how to explain some of these things. So this is a really great experience for me. And I hope you all have a really wonderful 4th of July weekend.
Thank you. This is definitely mind expanding that what we saw today. So I really appreciate it. Thank you very much, Allie. Thank you, everybody. Don't forget that next month is in-person demo at the gallery. Okay, bye-bye, everybody.